NBC News is reporting tonight that the president's anger is volcanic. The Washington Post is using the same word to describe the president's anger, and the Washington Post says that the president is, quote, absolutely livid over what he considers a treasonous act of disloyalty, meaning, of course, the publication of an op-ed piece in the New York Times today by an anonymous author with the title, I am part of the resistance inside the Trump administration. The Washington Post reports that the president suspects that the administration official who wrote the piece, quote, works on national security issues or in the Justice Department, according to two people familiar with his private discussions. And on that point of suspicion, I actually agree with the president. I agree with that suspicion. And I will, as I said, offer my guess about who wrote that op-ed piece later in this hour. We will open it up for that later in the hour. The striking thing about the Trump White House reaction to the op-ed piece is the full acceptance of the idea that someone inside the Trump administration really is the author of the piece. There is no reason to doubt that, of course, because the New York Times would never falsely describe the author of this piece, who they simply identify as a senior official in the Trump administration whose identity is known to us and whose job would be jeopardized by its disclosure. Those are the words describing the New York Times source. And one strategy for Donald Trump could have been to insist that the article is completely fake, that it doesn't come from anyone inside the White House. And the closest he has actually come to saying that in his volcanic reaction on Twitter and elsewhere is to just weakly put it as a question, saying, does the so-called senior administration official really exist, or is it just the failing New York Times with another phony source? And in that same tweet, the president then, believing that the source does exist, insists that the New York Times should turn that person over to the government for national security purposes. The op-ed piece comes a day after excerpts from Bob Woodward's new book, Fear, paint a very similar picture of the workings of the Trump presidency. The op-ed says, quote, many of the senior officials in his own administration are working diligently from within to frustrate parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations. I would know. I am one of them. The root of the problem is the president's amorality. The president's leadership style, which is impetuous, adversarial, petty, and ineffective. Senior officials will privately admit their daily disbelief at the commander-in-chief's comments and actions. Most are working to insulate their operations from his whims. It may be cold comfort in this chaotic era, but Americans should know that there are adults in the room. We fully recognize what is happening, and we are trying to do what's right, even when Donald Trump won't. And in what is the single most dramatic revelation in the op-ed piece, the author says, given the instability many witnessed, there were early whispers within the cabinet of invoking the 25th Amendment, which would start a complex process for removing the president, but no one wanted to precipitate a constitutional crisis. So we will do what we can to steer the administration in the right direction until, one way or another, it's over. Given the instability that I witnessed, there were early comments on this program at this hour about the 25th Amendment. I believe this was the first place where the 25th Amendment was discussed after Donald Trump was inaugurated. Exactly 1 month into the Trump presidency, perhaps with some members of the Trump cabinet watching, I described how the 25th Amendment can be used to remove the president and make the vice president what the 25th Amendment calls the acting president. Under the 25th Amendment, the vice president and a majority of the cabinet can decide to invoke the 25th Amendment. Here's what I said 1 month into the Trump administration. That is entirely up to the vice president and a majority of the cabinet. They don't need Donald Trump to become medically unable to do the job. They don't need a written opinion from a psychiatrist that Donald Trump is insane. If the president objects to such an action taken by the vice president and the majority of the cabinet, then the amendment provides that, quote, Congress shall decide the issue. And that will be determined by a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress. And when those votes are counted, Mike Pence could become acting president. Using the 25th Amendment is not, in fact, a complex process, as the op-ed described it today. But that section of the op-ed could simply mean that the members of the cabinet who were whispering about invoking the 25th Amendment early on realized that they probably could not win that two-thirds vote in the House and in the Senate after Donald Trump would object to their use of the 25th Amendment. And that's why they decided not to try it. Today's op-ed piece will take its place in history for many reasons, but it is the first recorded instance in the history of the 25th Amendment of that amendment being discussed in a White House where the president is physically healthy and fully conscious. The cabinet was whispering about the 25th Amendment early on because of Donald Trump's amorality. And so, according to today's New York Times op-ed piece, as the resistance was marching in the streets against the president of the United States, some sleeper cells of the resistance were beginning to take up positions inside the Trump administration. And tonight, the president of the United States will try to go to sleep without knowing who those members of the resistance are in his own White House and in his own administration. And so, Donald Trump's circle of trust has reportedly been reduced to a point that seemed easily predictable at the outset. The Washington Post is reporting tonight Trump already felt that he had a dwindling circle of people he could trust, a senior administration official said. According to one Trump friend, he fretted after Wednesday's op-ed that he could only trust his children. Leading off our discussion now, Jeremy Bash, an MSNBC national security analyst and former chief of staff at the CIA and Defense Department. Ron Klain, the former chief of staff to Vice Presidents Joe Biden and Al Gore, and a former senior aide to President Obama. And also with us, Ambassador Wendy Sherman, former Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs and an MSNBC Global Affairs contributor. Wendy Sherman is the author of the new book, Not for the Faint of Heart: Lessons in Courage, Power, and Persistence. And Wendy Sherman, Donald Trump needs a lesson in what your book teaches, but he seems completely oblivious to everything that all of you on this first panel know about government and how it works. And it's the reason you're all here is because this is a story about the internal workings of a White House and of a presidential administration. You have all been there, and we all know, and the world knows, that we have never seen anything like what we saw in the New York Times today. And Ambassador Sherman, I just want to get your reaction to any part of that op-ed piece as you've read it.
You know, there's been a lot of discussion about the process, who it is, which you'll get to later this evening, why he did it, why he didn't come forward, why he didn't have the courage that John McCain's funeral spoke to all of us about all weekend long. But the real point here is what you said at the beginning. It's the president's behavior. And I said, actually on Morning Joe yesterday, that sadly, I think he is unfit and he should step aside. And it may take a 25th Amendment to get him to step aside, but what I really think will get him to step aside is November's election. I don't think that we will have, as you said, a two-thirds majority in the House or the Senate, Republican-controlled. They're all too worried about their own heinies, quite frankly. It will take the election to say the times have changed. There's a new generation of leadership. We saw that in Massachusetts this week. And it's time for the kind of courage and the use of power that will protect the United States of America.
Ron Klain, I know you have an educated guess about this, too, and we're going to get who the source is. We're going to get to that later in the hour. But I want to get your reaction to what was your immediate reaction, other than who the author was, when you read this today?
Well, Lawrence, I think it speaks to a constitutional crisis, a corruption crisis, and a chaos crisis. The constitutional crisis is we have a president who members of his own team believe is unfit to be president. That's a constitutional crisis. There's a corruption crisis here, too, because the author of this piece essentially says, hey, we left him in place because we like tax cuts, military spending, and deregulation. And if the Republican Party is complicit in an amoral, an unfit president because they're getting goodies for their donors, that's just corruption at a rank and serious level. And finally, there's a chaos crisis that we see both in the Woodward book and in this op-ed. You have people in the president's administration running around undoing his decisions, not following his orders, ignoring what he says. That's chaotic. That's no way to run the government.
Donald Trump tweeted tonight simply the word treason, ? In capital letters. I have an answer for him. The answer is no. We have not had a treason case in America since World War II because, as I've said before in this program, and no one seems to listen, the United States Supreme Court has interpreted the Constitution's reference to treason as being as requiring a declaration of war and requiring cooperation with the country who we have declared war with in order to get to the standard of treason. And that's why we have not had a treason case since our last declaration of war, which is World War II. Jeremy Bash, pardon that longer parentheses than I intended, but sometimes the president is watching and he might learn something. But where do you see this going? What happens tomorrow, Jeremy, in the Trump administration?
Well, look, I think in some ways this anonymous piece may give rise to other voices to come out, to speak out, and to say, yes, indeed, we have a two-track presidency. And I think this is mostly relevant in the area of national security, which is where I suspect this person works. But also, it's the focus of the piece, the two-track presidency, where, in essence, we have foreign policy decision-making that's being carried out by the career staff, the professionals, as well as the senior appointees who know how to manage foreign policy issues. They are trying to keep things on an even keel, trying to work with allies, trying to be tough on our adversaries. Then there's the president going off in a completely different direction, having policies vis-a-vis Russia and North Korea that are completely at odds. And I think it's one thing if it happens in domestic policy, but when it happens in national security policy, it's matters of war and peace, matters of life and death.
And Wendy Sherman, this op-ed piece creates either more confusion in the world or perhaps more clarity in the world, because our partners in the world, our adversaries in the world, other countries in the world have been wondering all along how you deal with this Trump White House and how you deal with Donald Trump. And this op-ed piece is saying you have to find the real person. If you really want to deal with the Trump administration on X, whatever that is, find the real person who's in control of that, because it's not the president. It's the person who controls the paper involving X, and that person might or might not put that piece of paper or remove that piece of paper from the president's desk. So dealing with this presidency, it seems, as after this op-ed piece, becomes probably even more complex for foreign countries.
I think a lot of national security leaders around the world, a lot of leaders around the world have gone and found those people that they can relate to, that they can talk to. But quite frankly, in the end, it doesn't matter because the president keeps pulling the rug out from under the people who are doing the work. We've seen time and time again, he'll say, I'll meet with President Rouhani of Iran anytime, any place without conditions. And then we have Secretary Pompeo coming forward and saying, well, no, not really. We want these conditions and these conditions and these conditions. So in the end of the day, no one can be sure who is trying to keep our state, our country safe and protected on the right course. They're never sure whether the rug's going to be pulled out from under them. And in the past, Lawrence, great patriots have left our government over issues of morality. Dick Holbrooke, Tony Lake, famously during the Vietnam War, they were Foreign Service officers. They could not stay. And I have said to many Foreign Service officers, I'm sure Jeremy and Ron have said to other people in the administration that we know, stay up until the point where it is ethically and morally not possible for you to do so, and then have the courage to speak out and speak your convictions. I wish this person had not spoken anonymously. Perhaps there's reason why the person did what they did, but what really matters here is changing the President of the United States, changing our politics, finding the courage, the persistence to get the job done for us.
And Rod Klain, when we think of the principled resignations, the threshold has been so much lower in the past. And there was actually one that I can think of in the Clinton administration, which was an assistant secretary in Health and Human Services, about welfare policy, because Bill Clinton compromised too much, in his view, with the Republicans, and he, on principle, resigned over that. And Ron, I want to read you something that Senator Bob Corker said today, which it's one of those things that is both shocking and, as soon as you read it, completely obvious and was somewhere in the back of your head and in your set of assumptions already. Bob Corker, having read the New York Times op-ed piece, then said, I didn't think that anything was relayed in that op-ed that was new. I mean, I think this is what all of us have understood to be the situation from day one. And so, again, it's not it didn't reveal much to me. I understand this is the case.
Yeah, and it points to another group that is responsible for the situation this op-ed lays out, and that's the Republican leadership in Congress, which has failed to do their job of holding the president accountable. Even the ones who tweet and sometimes speak against him, Bob Corker, Jeff Flake, and the Tiskers on Capitol Hill, issue these mild rebukes rhetorically and then go and vote with the president up and down the line. And as you mentioned at the outset, someone who wanted to invoke the 25th Amendment would have to believe they had 2/3 of the Congress behind them for it to stick. And what these Republicans on Capitol Hill bowing to Trump's will, issuing tweets but not taking stands against him, that's what empowers the situation we face as a country right now.
And Jeremy Bash, we don't know what 2/3 of either body is going to look like after this upcoming election. But here you have as much chaos as we've ever seen in the Trump White House as Donald Trump has been attempting to lead the Republicans in their reelection campaigns.
That's right, Lawrence. And I think the unavailability of the 25th Amendment is because, first, you'd have to have the vice president on board.
Yes.
Second is you'd have to have the majority of the cabinet. And third, as just referenced, you'd have to have 2/3 of both chambers. And so what is a professional working on, say, national security or security matters to do? They're going to put their head down, do their job, and not do what the president says, and carry out this quiet resistance. And I just want to say, I don't think it's mysterious. It's not deep state-ish. It's not in any way improper. I think it's frankly patriotic. I think it's the right thing to do. And it's what many of our neighbors, colleagues, friends here in Washington are sadly doing each and every day.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.